So hey everybody, I'm Anna Harvey. I'm president of the Social Science Research Council and a professor of politics at New York University. And what I'm going to talk to you about for the next few minutes is a new initiative at the SSRC on platform economics. So the premise of the initiative is that platform regulation should be guided as much as possible by science. And so what we've done is to pull together a research consortium of faculty and graduate students in economics who are doing experimental work on the platforms. And the hope is that this work can inform policy and regulatory efforts. And if you're curious, the reason why it's just economics is because this is part of Hewlett's effort to support new frontiers of research in the discipline of economics. And you might have seen there was an article, there's some news this week about the work that Hewlett is doing. So I'm going to talk to you just briefly about three areas we're looking at: content moderation, consumer protection, and antitrust. So content moderation, there have been a number of legislative proposals that would require the platforms to exercise more robust content and more extensive content moderation. And there have been some free speech concerns raised in response to those proposals. We have a different kind of concern, which is just what effect does moderation have on users on a platform? So one of the researchers in our consortium recently conducted a field experiment on Twitter in which he randomized problematic tweets to be reported to Twitter or not. And one of the things he found was that users who post problematic content were actually more likely, they spent more time on the platform after having been reported, including more time spent posting problematic tweets. He also found that when he experimentally increased the perception among Twitter users of the extent of moderation on the platform, it didn't change their valuation. So this is some new emerging research, and we're supporting it that we should be thinking about as we move forward in terms of thinking about whether content moderation is or can be an effective regulatory strategy. Another area that we're looking at is consumer protection. So legislatures have the power to regulate products and markets in the interest of consumer health and safety. And one of the concerns that's been raised about the platforms is whether they induce addictive behavior. And so there have been by now a number of deactivation field experiments on the platforms where users are incentivized randomly into they're randomized into a financial incentive condition in which they will receive a financial payoff if they deactivate their access to one or more platforms. And one of the things the experimenters have found is that even after deactivation, users spend less time on the platforms. Another thing they've found is that after deactivation, you have to pay people less in order to get them to deactivate a second time. And both of those are consistent with the kind of addictive behavior that we see in other domains, for example, nicotine addiction. And there's a ballpark estimate that about a third of the time spent on platforms is driven by addictive behavior. So we know that cigarette taxes have been an effective regulatory strategy for reducing both smoking and mortality. And so it's possible we'll see more attention paid to taxation as a strategy to address addictive behavior on the platforms. And if you've been following, you know that my colleague at NYU, Paul Romer, has been a supporter of taxation of ad revenue on the platforms. And then finally, we're looking at some of the implications of this work for antitrust policy. It's really challenging to think about how to evaluate mergers of digital platforms because we never see prices. So, normally if you were thinking about evaluating mergers, you'd want to ask questions like, well, when a firm raises the price for its product, do consumers have alternatives to which they can substitute? And if they do, well, that's good. That's a competitive market. But if the merger that's being proposed is between two firms between which consumers substitute, that might raise some concerns about anti-competitive effects. But since we don't see what happens when the platforms raise their prices, we don't see substitution behavior, it's hard to think about mergers. So research has been thinking about how to use these deactivation experiments to look at substitution after deactivation. There was a recent deactivation experiment that took this strategy, deactivating users from either Instagram or YouTube using parental control software, and found a couple things. The first is that there's a fair amount of substitution to offline behavior, and that's a little troubling from an antitrust standpoint because it means that users didn't have an acceptable substitute in the market. There was another finding, There's another finding that there's a fair amount of cross-category substitution, meaning between social media, communication, entertainment platforms, which again, now that tells you that those firms aren't really competing, those platforms aren't really competing in separate markets, they're competing against each other. So that means we might want to think about mergers between, say, Instagram and Facebook and WhatsApp. And then finally, there's the finding that the kind of addictive behavior that's been found in other deactivation experiments increases both of those aspects of market power. So this is work that, again, we're supporting. We look forward to seeing more of it. So we're just super excited to be supporting this work. We think it's kind of a new frontier. It's giving us evidence about user behavior on platforms that we didn't really have before. If you're interested, you want to find out more, you want to engage, just get in touch with us. You can use that email, or I'm pretty easy to find on the internet. Thanks, everybody.